introduce Burt Kelchner, our speaker this morning. And this is the real Burt Kelchner, by the way. Burt was going to do this talk back in May, but due to a medical problem that Burt had back then, we had to postpone until today. But the anticipation of the talk is going to be worthwhile. I want to talk to you about our upcoming speakers. It's September 26th. Alfred McLaren. Alfred was a veteran sub-commander. He served on 4 nuclear attack subs during the Cold War. Should be a great talk. We've had actually several sub-commanders, and including our own Jerry Chesser, who's a enlisted submariner who was the highest ranking submariner who was Master Chief back then. On October 10th, Senior Master Chief. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Glad he's not here. All right. Then on October 10th, we have Royal Schmidt. Royal served as a staff sergeant with Charlie Company, 160th Battalion, 40th Infantry Division during World War II in the Pacific. And then on October 24th, Don Schaefer. Don was in the Marine Corps during Vietnam, 1966 to 1970. So that takes us through October. And then our movie day coming up on the 23rd of September, The Enemy Below with Robert Mitchum and Kurt Juergens. What Lou failed to remind you of is our donations, and of course we accept donations at all times. And yes, we do repeatedly remind you of that. And then restrooms are over here on my left, down the hallway, around on the other side of the office. And also Broomfield Days next weekend. I'm sure you're all aware of that if you're here locally. And the museum will be open. Pretty much the concurrent hours of Broomfield Days will be open at 9 and through the afternoon. Lou, are we going to be open beyond our normal 3 o'clock on next Saturday?
If we have people here,
Okay. All right. So just for that particular information. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to turn this over to Burt, and we'll get started. And feel free to ask Burt questions during the talk, and we'll get started. There we go.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. Now, I'm kind of hard of hearing, so I have my hearing aids in, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them anytime. But I may have to ask you to repeat it because the hearing aids, how many here have hearing aids? They don't always work too well, do they? Okay.
That's what my wife says.
Well, I have given this talk a number of times through the years, but only recently with the PowerPoint program. After Los Alamos, I came up to help design parts of Rocky Flats, and I was a manager there at Rocky Flats through the years, and so I have a lot of experience with the program all these years. I was there for 31 years till I retired. So I have given this talk through Rocky Flats at times to civilian groups and to clubs like Kiwanis and so forth. And then in recent years I've had this PowerPoint program, and I've given three talks to various groups, including yours today, on the PowerPoint. So if you have any questions as I go along, I'll be happy to answer them. Now, Ed said that I should start with this summary. And I'll give you that verbally, but you can follow along here if you wish. I was born and raised in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Anybody know where that is? Several people. Eastern Pennsylvania, almost on the New Jersey border, almost just a few miles from the Delaware River. And I went to school there, of course. I went through high school there. In those days, the city was about 50,000. It's a little bigger now. And they only had one high school because there was a few communities surrounding the city. But it was a big high school. We had over 2,000 people in the high school. So I was in a graduating class of 560. And it was, like I say, a big school, wonderful place. And from there, I got a half scholarship to attend Moravian College, which is a very good little college in Bethlehem. Lehigh University is also in my hometown. And so when I was attending Moravian, the war started. And as soon as it started, of course, I wanted to volunteer. And my family and the people at the college said, "No, Burt, don't be so hasty. They'll get you when they want you. Why don't you stay here?" Well, I wasn't quite satisfied with that, so I joined the Army Reserve. I was in my junior year at that time, and I joined the Army Reserve. So then the school went on a quicker schedule, and I graduated in January of 1943 instead of June of 43 like most colleges do, or May. So after I graduated, then the Army Reserve called me up, and I went to Fort Meade as my induction center, Fort Meade, Maryland. And from Fort Meade, since I had gotten a degree in chemistry at Moravian College, they decided to send me to a chemical warfare camp. It was a temporary camp down in Alabama, and you know, most guys in the military never got sent where they were in their background, but me, I was lucky. They sent me there. Not that it mattered, because I didn't know anything about the chemical warfare service business. So I was there for basic training, and I went through regular basic. It was like infantry basic, and but it was kind of funny. We didn't have any rifles. They didn't have enough, so we carried wooden rifles to learn to march and everything. Wooden rifles. And then when it was time to go on the range for practice, we had old Army Springfields, the 906 or 7 Springfields, and that's what we used for practice. And I turned out to be a pretty good shot. I got a marksman medal out of it. But anyway, I was just about ready to finish basic. I had about 2 weeks to go when I got called into the captain's office, and he said, "Burt, would you like to go to something special?" And I said, "I don't know, what is this a special?" He says, "Well, it's the Army Specialized Training Program." Do any of you know what the Army Specialized Training Program was? Well, about in early 1943, probably, or maybe late 42, the government realized that they had drafted so many men into the military that all of a sudden there were no men in the colleges, and they were going to lose a whole generation of educated men, and particularly scientists and engineers. And so they formed what they called the Army Specialized Program, Training Program, and they sent thousands of us and the troops to schools all over the country. Well, for me, after I took the tests at the University of Alabama, I was there for about 4 weeks and took the tests, and they assigned me then to go to Virginia Tech. And I went to Virginia Tech, where I got a degree in chemical engineering. And there again, just before I got the degree, and I thought I wouldn't get it, a bunch of men came into the campus, and I was interviewed by the dean of Brown University. And he said, "Burt, would you like to go to something special?" Here I go again. I said, "Well, sure, what is it?" He says, "Well, I can't tell you, but I think you would like it." So I said, "Sure, I'll try it." Well, guess what? I wound up at Los Alamos. So, because Los Alamos at that time had about, I would say 100 of the top scientists of the country, some Nobel winners, Nobel Prize winners, but others were deans of their university or whatnot in all the various specialties, you know, metallurgy, chemistry, physics, and what have you. But they weren't used to doing work in the laboratories, so they needed hands-on people in the laboratories. So they got a whole bunch of us, about 500 of us when I was there at first, of people from the Army to be the hands-on people in the laboratory, to do the work for them. They would tell us what to do and we would do the work. So we acted like graduate students to them in reality. And I was there then in the Army for 2 years doing my specialty. And at the end of that time, when I was discharged in 1946, I went back as a civilian, and I worked there another 6 years. And by this time, I'd had some promotions, and I had some people working for me. And finally, when Rocky Flats came along, Dow Chemical wanted experienced people to help set up the plant here, and they gave me a very, very nice offer to come up here, and I was there for 31 years then for that. So that's kind of my background. And now, I guess if you have any questions, I'll answer them, and then we'll get into the program. No questions. Well, okay. Now I'm going to have this in hand, and I will step back. You can still see me okay? Okay. Here we go. All right, next slide. Now, I have to explain what an SED was. SED stands for Special Engineering Detachment, and we were the Special Engineering Detachment 9612. Can you imagine that? 9,612 Special Engineering Detachments. What a bunch of baloney. But they called it that just because they had to give it some kind of a name. And of all the GIs at Los Alamos, we had the SEDs, which were us who worked in the laboratory for the scientists, and they had a big contingent of MPs for security around the area, because it was on a plateau of the Piorito Mountains, and on the plateau there, with big canyons on either side, it was so rough they couldn't use jeeps to do it all, so they had a number of MPs on horseback to do the rest. And then they also had a small contingent of WWIIs there, because they needed some secretarial help for people, so that there were probably, well, it was one barracks full of WWIIs, maybe up to 100 or something like that. And then the last group of people of military there was the motor pool people, and they had of course to keep a lot of trucks and jeeps and stuff going, so they had a motor pool there, and of course they had a gas station there, so that for the few civilians, the top civilians that had just a handful of cars there, they could get gas through there. Okay, so that's the background of that. That's why I'm an SED. Next. I guess I've told you that already. Next. Next. And I think I've told you that too. Now the place. It's a very, very beautiful place. I have one man I talked to here that was there on business and has seen it. It's on a plateau. It's the mountains on the backdrop. It comes off, and there's a big shelf of flat area broken by canyons there. And we were up on one of the mesas with a big canyon on either side of us that was about 500 feet deep. So you go out and you look almost straight down 500 feet. And the width at the broadest place was maybe a half mile, and the length was about 2 miles, something like that, of this mesa. And so they could really control it security-wise quite well because of the terrain. And they had a little airfield at the end of the mesa. The mesa was sort of shaped, I have a picture of it coming up, but like this, sort of pie-shaped. And at the end, it was narrow, and they had the airfield at the end. And the planes that came in, military planes, mostly on occasion, were carrying famous people there that needed to do some work at the lab. They would come in like coming in on a carrier. They would come in and they had to put on the brakes, and because there wasn't a very long airfield, they couldn't land a very big plane there. The biggest plane I can remember landing there was what was the early transport planes? There were huh?
A DC-3?
Yeah. They could get a DC-3 in there. That was about the size, the biggest size. Now, some more about the geography of the place. It is just north of the Rio Grande River, so when you came down to the bottom of the hill off the mesa, you dropped in elevation from 7,200 feet down to about 5,000 feet where the river went through. And the river, in years before the war, had a little narrow gauge railroad through there. And you'll see pictures of this too, I think, as we go along. And I'll point that out. Okay. Now this is a very famous lady. She was one of the few women that were in the management group, you might speak, of the laboratory, and she had her office in Santa Fe. And how many of you have been in Santa Fe? All right, you know where the Palace of the Governors is. Well, she was just to the south of there, about a block and a half on Palace Avenue, and she had her office there. So that when I got sent out there, we reported to that office, and I got my picture badge made there, and the first security talk, and then from there I could go up to Los Alamos on a military bus. Now everybody that worked at Los Alamos had to go through that office to get their clearance to start. So it was a very important place. Next. Now it's hard to see, but you can see the airfield here at the end of the mesa, and then it goes back to where the Pajarito Mountains are, and with a canyon on either side. And it was quite a place. Next. Now, the background of selecting this place is kind of interesting. Dr. Oppenheimer, who was the head of the laboratory at the time, grew up in California, but his family had a summer home across the valley on the other side of the Rio Grande in the Jemez Mountains. And he had, as a boy, when they vacationed there, they would travel around, and they had traveled up to this site where the boys' school was. This was a school for incorrigible boys, and rich families would send their kids there up on the hill to this small school. They only had about 60 kids in the school there before the war, and they, I think, probably became men there. They learned that. They learned to horseback ride. They learned how to plant gardens, and as well as getting their regular education. They lived under quite Spartan conditions. They had no running water. They had outdoor toilets. The old bit, you know, that us old folks were kind of familiar with. I grew up in a home back in Bethlehem that out on the edge of town that had no running water and had an outside john, stuff like that. Anyway, and another person that had been at the boys' school there was our first commanding officer at Los Alamos. He was a colonel, and he had gone there. Well, somehow he and Oppenheimer had met, and they decided that this was a location that they really wanted for several reasons. First of all, they wanted it to be isolated so they could have top-grade security, which they could accomplish at a place like that. Second of all, they wanted good climate, and it was a very nice climate there. In summer, it got up into the low 80s in the summertime because of the elevation, much like here when you go up in the foothills. And in the wintertime, the winters were generally mild. We did have, while I lived there, we did have 2 winters that had some pretty heavy snow, but otherwise didn't snow often or very deeply. So they had good weather. And the third one was they needed a lot of sunshine for the photography that the laboratory had to do in connection with the research. And we did have beautiful sunshiny days the most of the time. And then, let's see, was there another reason? Oh, the other reason was they had to have decent access to a railroad because they would be hauling a lot of heavy equipment up there to build the laboratory and then bring in some of the big machinery that they needed in the physics department, I can't think of the name of it now, but you know what I mean, some of these big physics things. So there was a spur line from the main route of the Atchison and Topeka and the Santa Fe, which went south of Los Alamos from Chicago to Los Angeles. It was about 9 or 10 miles south of Santa Fe, but there was a spur line from there up to Santa Fe that would take passengers and freight up there. So they had freight capability to Santa Fe, and then they could put it on big trucks and take it up the hill to the laboratory. So that was the last reason for that. Okay, now at the school itself, these are original buildings. There have since been, that one has been remodeled since. There's a nice little hotel now. This one that was torn down after the war because they needed space for other things. The top building was the administration building for the school. The teachers lived there. They had a cafeteria for them and some of their offices and so forth. And then this building was where all the students lived. It was called the Big House. And they had their sleeping quarters there, and they had a recreation area there where they could play pool and ping pong and stuff like that. Next. I've gone through that, I guess. Next. Now, when I say all personnel there had to receive special clearances to live and work there, I will say that there were 2 kinds of clearances. One was called a P clearance, which stood for preliminary. That meant that the In those days, the FBI did all the clearances, and what it was the precursor to the FBI at that time, whatever they're called, and they just wanted to make sure that you had no jail record or anything bad like that in your background to let you work up there. But those people that had P clearances would be construction workers that were there. There's a fly around here that just won't let me go.
Just won't let you alone.
The construction workers had P clearances, so they could get up there to do all the construction at the site, which included both the laboratories and housing for the scientists and the military. And but they had no idea what was going on in the laboratory. And we also, of course, had some janitorial people from the civilians down in the valley that would come up every day, and they had to have P clearance. And unfortunately, in the military, we had civilian cooks in the mess hall, so we really had some decent food there all the time. I don't think anybody in the military ever had any better food than we had. And then the other clearance was a Q clearance, so I came up first as a P clearance, and then they had to go through another 6 weeks of real intensive background to make sure that I could be cleared to hear all about the atomic bomb and whatever secret information was passed around. Now, even the Q clearance had this caveat, and that was need to know. You got to know everything that you needed to know to do your job. And I didn't know what was going on in the physics departments or some of the theoretical departments or the departments that were building the other parts of the bomb, unless I had need to know what was going on there. Then I would be told, and that's the way that was worked. So I think only the top scientists there, maybe a couple of dozen people, had full clearance for everything. So next. Now the population. They started out with several hundred scientists, I think, maybe like on the order of 200, and these were all men from, like I say, from big universities around the country, as specialists in various fields, and mathematics and physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and so forth. And they came out, and as if they had families, there was housing provided for them and their families. And then the 500 initial military personnel of us, and then it grew to nearly 3,000 people by the end of the war, because they also built housing for all the construction people, and they kept building laboratories and needed more space. And not only on the hill, but as we call the plateau, but back up toward the mountain, across for about 10 miles, we had, let's see, no, not 10 miles, 5 miles maybe, we had 100 square miles of property that the government purchased when they purchased the school and the surrounding property. We had about 100 square miles, 10 by 10. And out in the boonies is where they did their tests on the implosion work, where they would make sure that the device would blow inward properly in all points and stuff like that. Now today the population is around 17,000. I've got a bunch of references here that you can look up on the computer if you want. You can get all kinds of information about Los Alamos today, including how to make a bomb, which of course you really couldn't do because it requires so much equipment and space, and and safety and all that stuff that I don't know. Iran in their programs are, I don't know how safe they are, but they certainly have the equipment, and they would have the ability to make a bomb if they wanted to. I hope they never do. Well, at any rate, next. Now, the civilians came from, like I say, a lot of those people were well-to-do because they had good university jobs and they lived in nice homes. And they came up there, and the best they could do were what we call the Sunt apartments. A contractor by the name of Sunt built a bunch of apartments which were 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units, and for depending on how many children they had. There weren't very many of those. And some of the civilians had to live in dormitories. The unmarried ones lived in dormitories, but they even had some dorms for what they call married dorms, where a couple could live. And those were just a bedroom with a day room downstairs on the first floor, common bathrooms. You had to walk to the end of the hall, the bathroom, all that kind of stuff. But the construction workers lived in terrible conditions, the ones that lived on the hill, because you'll see pictures of that as we go along. Now, my life, though, was really good because they didn't, the laboratory treated those of us that worked in the lab as civilians. So by 8 o'clock in the morning when we went to work, and until we quit at 5 in the afternoon, or if we had to work overtime at night, we were civilians really, as far as they were concerned. And when we go back to the barracks, we didn't have to do anything that most GIs had to do, like I did in basic training and you guys did at various places. We didn't have to clean latrines. We didn't have to do any of that stuff. We didn't have to do our laundry. That was all done for us. The only thing that we did in our barracks was we kept the pot-bellied stoves going in the wintertime when it was cold. Otherwise, we had to get up, stand reveille, and after reveille, we went to breakfast, which was only across the street and about a half a block away. And then from there, we went to work. And when we come back at night, we could do anything we wanted till the next morning. Now, next. Oh, okay, now we talked about some of these things. Let's show pictures next. Now, those are the Sunt apartments there. And they were fairly decent inside. They had running water, hot and cold, and they had heat furnished by steam. We had a big boiler plant to run the laboratory for heat all around, and so they were steam heated. Some of the other places where people lived, they just had potbelly stoves or whatever. Not everybody was as lucky as those people. Here's some of the what it looks like where the construction workers lived in those Quonset type buildings. And of course, in those days, there were no dryers yet, so everybody hung their wash out on clotheslines. And next. Now, for the top people at Los Alamos, the boys' school had about a dozen log cabins for their administrators and teachers, each cabin containing a fireplace and a bathtub, hence the name Bathtub Row. Now these units were assigned to Dr. Oppenheimer, to Colonel Ashley, who was our commander at the time, the post commander, and the very top scientists such as Fermi, Bethe, and von Neumann. Next. Now this is an efficiency apartment. This picture was taken after the war because that car wasn't parked there at that time. And after the war was over, my wife and I had an apartment like this when I came back as a civilian. Next. When I was there in the military, we had really nice barracks with upper and lower bunks, showers and latrines at the end of the building. And I've already talked about some of that, I guess. Next. I don't know what barracks this was. I got this picture. No cameras were allowed to anyone at Los Alamos except the official ones that took pictures for the laboratory. And there's a lot of pictures in these books here that you see from the old days. And they took a picture of that SED barrack, and I don't know which one it was. There was A, B, and C barrack, and I was in B barracks. So I don't, but I know that I'm not in any official picture that they ever took. I can see friends of mine in some of the pictures, but I never appeared. Next. All right, we went through that. Next. Now here are just some pictures of people that they took during the war. Here's Groves is the big guy. He was kind of fat, and he was a general in the Corps of Engineers, and he was in charge of construction for the Pentagon before our buildings were built. So he was a very experienced man, and he did a good job. I mean, he knew how to get it done. Not like this fiasco at the Veterans Administration here. Hi.
Can you talk about really the living conditions? Because there's a book, The Wives of Los Alamos, and there's a local author who wrote a book, and it's kind of like a lot of the wives of the scientists just couldn't take it there. I mean, it was just not anything like they were accustomed to. I mean, the rain and muddy, you know.
You're right.
I mean, it was terrible, and the food store didn't have everything.
Yeah, you're right. Some of the wives had terrible time, but once they were there, they could not leave because of security. They didn't want anybody to be caught by spies somewhere and interrogated for what they might know. So there was just a no-no. And I was going to mention about the security in regard to mail. When I got there, they told me I could only send mail to 3 people. My father, my mother had already passed away years while I was growing up. I could mail to my father, to my sister, who I had an older sister who sort of acted, she was 13 years older than I am, and she sort of brought me up as a kid. And a girlfriend, if I had one, and I did have a girlfriend at the time. So those 3 people I could write to, and I had to write a first letter that went through their security as to what I would say to them. And I was to tell them only that I was stationed in Santa Fe in a motor pool. And the address was Box 1663 Santa Fe. And that's all. And if you ever said anything in a letter later on that they didn't like, they would send it back to you, and you had to rewrite it or take it out, and then they would eventually pass it and send it through. And when I got mail from them, they opened it up first and read it to see what was being asked of me. And if they were asking questions, I never had any trouble with this, but some of them did. If they ever asked any questions about what you were doing that was a little off base, they would tell you what to send back to them as an answer. So that's the kind of security we had in those days.
Did General Groves replace Colonel Ashley?
No. Groves did not live there. He was also charge of construction at Oak Ridge and Hanford. So he had a hell of a big job to do. You bet. So he just went around to all three places as necessary. But I will say that you know, Congress didn't even know what was going on. The only people in Washington that knew about this were FDR and the Secretary of Defense and a couple of other people in budget, I guess. Congress did not know about this program, and Vice President
Truman.
Harry Truman.
Yeah, Harry Truman did not know of this until the president died, and then he was told. Can you imagine that kind of security anywhere today? Not with the Washington we have today. Okay, next. Now, as far as safety was concerned, safety, of course, in those days, even in industry in the United States, wasn't at a very high level like it is today. But whatever building codes were available at the time were followed by the construction companies in the laboratories. But even so, they worked very fast. They had this laboratory built, most of the buildings built within 1 year. When I got there, half of the place was already built, and while I was there, they built the other half. And of course, the construction was very modest. I mean, they were all wooden buildings, although they did have, where necessary, they did have sprinkler systems, for example, because there were some places they couldn't allow to have fires happen, so they had that already. So, but they had very few accidents there. Actually, I don't really know, but I imagine not more than a handful of construction workers were killed during that time, as fast as they worked. And they had like about 1,000 construction workers there at all times. Okay. Now, the Army buses ran 24 hours a day to Santa Fe, and the civilians could go, when they had time off, they could go to Santa Fe to shop or to eat at a restaurant if they wanted to. Now, of course, they could cook at home. Well, the only stores we had in town were the commissary, Army commissary, which carried about anything you wanted. And they had, like I say, this one gas station where the few cars could get gas, and a post office. Otherwise, everything you could get at the PX or the commissary. And but to go down to Santa Fe, and I'll show you about the Ottaway Bridge later on, you had to go down to the bottom of the hill till you got to the Rio Grande River, and then you had to go north along the Rio Grande over rolling country like this, with the mesas up beside you, through some Indian villages to the town of Espanola. I think if you were down there, you know where Espanola is. And there they had a regular, decent bridge to cross the Rio Grande that big trucks could cross on and everything. And then you had to go back up to Santa Fe. So, although we were only about 30 miles from Santa Fe as the crow flies, we had to travel more like about 50, 60 miles to get there and back. And I'll show you why later on. Okay. Next. There's the Ottaway Bridge. Now that's today is a national monument. It's still there, but not used anymore, of course. And that thing in its day would only take a limit of 5 tons. And of course we had these big military transports and stuff to take the heavy stuff. That obviously couldn't go over there. So nobody used it at that time. They blocked it off. And that's the Rio Grande through there. Rio Grande wasn't very wide through there, but it was pretty deep in places. Next. Now, there's what I was talking about shopping. Civilians could go down to Santa Fe to shop, and in those days, around the plaza, there were normal stores where you could buy almost anything. And after the war was over, when my wife and I would go down there, I bought the civilian clothes I wanted there, and she bought her clothing there. We could get anything we want. Today, it's all curio shops around the plazas, and all the shopping is away from there. But you could go to, those people could even go to Albuquerque if they wished to go that far, and if they could get fuel for their cars, because that was hard to get in those days, you know. And that was between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, about 60 miles on a narrow 2-lane paved road. That was a real horror. I can tell you some stuff about that. After toward the end of the war, I got married while I was at Los Alamos. They gave me leave to go back to Alabama where I had met my wife when I was there. And I had her come out the summer of 1945 because I could see that the war was going to be over when we set off those bombs. I was just sure of it. So anyway, she came out, and the closest our wives could be, or those that could find housing, was 100 miles. Well, Albuquerque met that condition, so I was lucky enough to find a little 1-bedroom apartment down toward the river in Old Town. And to visit her, once she was there, well, by this time they were allowing us GIs to have leave on Sunday. So I would go down Saturday night after I finished work, because we were working 6 hours a day, 6 days a week there. I would go down after work to Santa Fe, get there about 7 o'clock, and I would go out by the Capitol where the highway went down to Albuquerque from there, stuck up my hand. I'd get a ride within 15 minutes. But some of them were kind of hairy going down that narrow 2-lane road. No speed limits. Some of those people drove 90 miles an hour. And oh man, I went down with 2 drunken cowboys one day. That was the worst one. And we were just out of Santa Fe about 20 miles. And this guy up front says, hey, stop. And he rolled down the window and pulled out this big pistol. And he was going to shoot at a coyote. Well, luckily, the coyote went behind some bushes. He couldn't see it, so he didn't shoot. I was scared to death. But they got me to Albuquerque. Well, I'd get to Albuquerque about, say by 10, 11 o'clock at night usually. And I would either walk the half mile down to the river where our apartment was, or I could get a city bus maybe. And then I would spend that evening with my wife, and then the next day, Sunday night, and then Monday morning, I would get up real early, like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I would get a Greyhound bus up to Santa Fe, and then at Santa Fe I had to wait a while and get a post bus up to in time for reveille and breakfast. So did that a number of times. Okay, next. Okay. We had one interesting experience, and how many of you have seen cockroaches? Several, yeah. Now, I didn't think cockroaches lived at a high altitude like that, but one day we were at dinner in our mess hall, and the power went out for a while, and it was dark. And when the power came on, about a couple minutes later, there were cockroaches all over the place. Oh boy, did they ever clean house there to get rid of them. And that was the last I ever saw of cockroaches. But I didn't think they'd get them. They came up from food that came up from the south somewhere, you know, and they got in there. Okay. Oh, well, let me talk some more about the cafeteria where the civilians ate. They had, again, all the cooks at these mess halls and cafeterias were people from down in the valley. So we could certainly get some good Mexican food as well as good American food. And when it would come to Thanksgiving, boy, we had a really nice spread with turkey and the whole thing that you'd get at home and with a Thanksgiving dinner was really nice. Now, for the civilians that cooked at home, they could go to the commissary that had all the basic foods that they need. And so some of them did cook at home much of the time. Okay, next. Now, when it comes to the churches, they didn't have any at the beginning. And all they had had Army chaplains. They had a rabbi, and they had a Catholic chaplain and a Protestant chaplain. And so the military could go to those services, and the civilians, if they wanted to, could join in with those services. And some, of course, if they wanted to go to Santa Fe, if they wanted to go down on the bus or drive there, they could go to church that way. Next. Now, the first year I was there was no recreation for anybody, really. Us GIs, and I guess even the civilians, could borrow a horse from the remuda that the MPs had, and that was my only experience on horseback that I ever had since I was a city kid back home. And a couple of my friends said one day, "Hey, let's go down and get some horses and take a ride." And I said, "Okay, I'll try it." So we got down there, and the sergeant picked out some horses for us. And I don't know, he just picked out one for me. I didn't know one from the other. Got on his back, and we started going down the mesa toward the end there. And all of a sudden, the first one in line, I think there were 5 of us that went down that day. The first one in line broke into a trot. Well, I was bouncing along. And then he started to run. Oh, man, I held up for... Well, I didn't fall off, though. Good thing I didn't. But that was the last horseback ride I took. And then, as is usual, the GIs in the motor pool and the maintenance guys and all that, they were poker players. Us GIs and the SEDs, we learned to play bridge. We didn't play poker. Because we played some bridge with the civilians too. So I learned to play bridge there, and I've played bridge all my life since. But there was really no fraternization between the various groups. I never had any friends among the MPs or the maintenance people or the WAC, although some of our guys, I'm sure, dated some of the WACs once in a while. They probably did, but I didn't because I had this girlfriend and finally was married. But and I had nothing to do with the civilians during that time in the Army. After the war was over, I got to know quite a few of those scientists, some that were pretty high places. Okay, next. Military law was the only law in town, of course, because we had no civilian police or anything like that. And I know that the SEDs, at least, we never got into any trouble. I suppose there was some trouble once in a while in the motor pool or the maintenance guys, but the Army took care. There was no court martials or anything like that. But David Greenglass, who was in the SED, he was a machinist, and he was machining the explosive segments that go into the plutonium bomb, and he turned out to be a spy, but he never was He was sent to jail, but that was it. Okay, next. Now, this is kind of interesting. They only had one telephone line to the hill, and that was for official business only, classified, and otherwise from the administration people. None of the rest of us were ever allowed to use that telephone. Everything had to be by mail if you wanted to contact anybody at home. Okay, next. They did establish a school for the children of the civilians, and when it was all 12 grades, and they did hire some teachers for that school. We became good friends with one of the teachers there in later years, whose husband was a nuclear physicist there, and they lived in Boulder later on, and he also worked at Rocky Flats, and they were really nice people. Next, there's a picture of the first school up there. Then in later years, when we were there as civilians, they built this marvelous high school there. They had also an elementary school and a junior high, but that high school was built like a community center. It had a big auditorium, held about 2,000 people, and a big stage so that we could see Broadway plays occasionally there when they come to town. But this was after the war was over, and they had a swimming pool, and it was just a marvelous high school. Okay, next. Okay, the health care. Of course, the Army had to establish a small hospital there, and as a GI, I never had to use it, but in later years, after I was a civilian, my first two daughters were born in that military hospital, so they're kind of proud of that. My third daughter was born up here in Denver after we moved to Rocky Flats. But they had very good doctors there, of course, and good surgeons, and they had a good reputation as a hospital. Next. There's a picture of it there. This is Ashley Pond, which was a natural little pond that was there. It's still there today, and it's a little park around it now. And next. The working conditions for the, I've gone through some of this, but at the laboratories themselves, we had all the equipment we'd ever need. If we needed something for our research program, they would get it right away because they had top priority. And if they couldn't find it in commercial industry, they would go to a university or a company like General Motors, or, well, not General Motors, but General Electric or something like that, and take the equipment they needed from them and ship it out to us. For example, you all know how expensive platinum is. Well, I needed platinum to do my work, and I had a number of petri dishes, one about this big around and this deep, pure platinum. Today, they'd be worth a fortune. They'd be worth millions. But I was given this to do my work because I had to have that for the extreme purity of that I was working with to get because my specialty was chemistry of purification. And I worked for a man named Dr. Edward Wickers, who was the head of the Bureau of Standards back in Washington of their chemistry division, and he was my boss. And he was a man already about 55 or 60 years old, and he was actually internationally known because he was an expert in ultra pure materials and how to develop them. And the one thing that I had that he said he wished he could get credit for. My first work was on magnesium, and I, under his direction, prepared the purest magnesium ever done. And he said it was so good that he, if it wasn't for the war, he would go to the International Committee for Atomic Weights and see if we couldn't get our magnesium declared as the new weight for magnesium in the periodic table. And of course, at that time, I wasn't experienced enough to know what the hell he was really talking about. But anyway, it never could be done because of security. And then another thing that because of security, when we finally got to where they needed this ultra-pure enriched uranium to make the bomb to avoid pre-detonation, he set me on, because of that work, he set me on a research program to find the best method to get ultra-pure uranium nitrate. And I eventually devised the method to do that, and that's what my specialty was. So when it came time to build the first bomb, another GI and I worked 24 hours a day. I was on the day shift for 12 hours and he was on the night shift for 12 hours. And it took us about 2 weeks to prepare the ultra-pure uranium, about 20 kilograms of it, enough to make the first gun weapon. And that was what I really was noted for at Los Alamos. Well, let's see, now what's next? Next. This is where I work. This is the kind of laboratory buildings that you see around there, just wooden buildings. Inside they were decent enough. They were, they were heated. No air conditioning, of course, but didn't need it up there. But we had rudimentary containment systems for the radiation. Not as good as today by a long shot, but we had some. And then that building above there, which we called the ice house, sat along Ashley Pond, and that's where they did the first assembly of the first weapons. They did the one that was done for the test site down in southern New Mexico, and they did the first few nuclear plutonium weapons there later on. Next. Now there are the two bombs. The upper one is what they called the big boy, and that was the plutonium weapon. And it was so big it wouldn't go through a bomb bay of the B-29s at that time. So they took some B-29s down at Kirtland Air Base in Albuquerque and modified them with a new bomb bay door so they could drop that bomb. The lower one is called the little boy, and that was the one that contained the uranium that I worked on, and that uranium bomb was only about, the interior of that was only about that big around and about that long, and there were rings of uranium and then a plug of uranium. And when that plug was shot through there with a charge, when it went in there, it went critical, and that's what caused the explosion. Now the Fat Man, that was different. It was a spherical bomb about this big around, and had the plutonium core in the middle, and then it had all these explosive lenses around there, wired so. This was one of their biggest problems in there. The physicists had was how to set off every charge within about a millisecond, so that they would all go at the same time and compress the plutonium. Actually, the metal would actually compress from the force of that and go critical and go off. And that was the greatest achievement they ever made at that time. today, almost any country could make a uranium weapon, a gun weapon, for example. We don't make gun weapons anymore in this country. Well, of course, we haven't made nuclear weapons in a long time. We just take the stockpile that's left from whatever we have from international agreement, and the Los Alamos goes over them every few years and gets them up to specs again. But that plutonium weapon, that would be so difficult to make for most countries that I don't know. Iran could not make one. Next. Now the Trinity site. As we were approaching the finished weapons, they decided the uranium bomb was going to work. We're not going to waste the first enriched uranium we have on a test. We know it'll work. So they didn't use that. But we're not sure about the plutonium weapon. So we're going to test one down at just north of Alamogordo in New Mexico. There's a big plain there, or desert plain, called the Valley of Death. And that plain was used in the old days. The Spaniards crossed it a couple of times and found out it wasn't suitable. There was no water, it was so hot, and it was so rugged. So they didn't bother with it later on, and it came up along the Rio Grande Valley. But that area was desolate. It had, I think, 3 ranches on it that were really hard scrabble ranches. They couldn't find enough water and grass to really have a decent ranch, but there were people there. So the government bought the ranches from them, and they had this big acreage there. Oh, I don't know, it was 50 miles by 50 miles or something like that. That had moved everybody out. So they put the test stand there in that big tower that you see right in the middle of it. And then 10 miles to the north, they had the bunkers where they could watch it, because they were 10 miles away when that shot went off. And that was quite an explosion. I have an interesting little story about that. That was set off on a Monday morning at about 5 o'clock. And that was one of the days weekends when I was down visiting my wife. And in an apartment nearby, there was a GI that somehow had acquired a car. By this time, and he was allowed to have a car up in the hill. And so I got rides down to Albuquerque with him and back on Monday mornings to get to town. So we got up at about 4:30 because we were going to take off around 5 o'clock to get up there by 7 in time to go to work. And he said to me, he said, "Burt, did you see the flash?" And I said, "Oh my God, I forgot all about it." Because I could see the flash in Albuquerque 200 miles away. Wasn't that something? And of course in the paper, all carried an account that a huge ammunition dump had exploded. So nobody ever questioned it. And so it remained a secret until the war was over and the bomb was dropped. And then they told all about it. Next. That's a letter that I have at home from Dr. Oppenheimer thanking me for my specific work in the deal. Not many GIs got a letter like that, but he probably gave out, I don't know, 100 or so maybe, but not all GIs got them. It just depended on what they did. I'm very proud of that letter. And next, that's my honorable discharge. I went down to Fort Bliss for that. And as I told somebody here, although I was a technical sergeant, which was a sergeant with a T in it, which they don't have anymore in the Army, but that was a T4, grade T4. And when I got discharged, they knocked me back to T3. That's why it says T3 there. But even so, they paid my way home and my wife's home, and Los Alamos paid my way back when I was hired as a civilian, and we could, whatever furniture or stuff we wanted to send from our homes to start married life out there in our apartment. So I had a wonderful vacation, paid both ways, and that's about the end of my story at Los Alamos. That's it. Thank you.
Do you folks have any more questions for Burt?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Burt, did you know, were you aware of what they were going to do with the bombs? Is there any?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I was, by that time, this is another little story. I was one of about 300 of the SEDs who were given staff status. So we were on the actual staff of the laboratory, where the rest were just workers. And as staff members, we got to know everything as everything was going along. I could go to the meetings where the big guys spoke about their problems and how they were going to go about it. All this kind of stuff. I got to hear Fermi and Oppenheimer and even Niels Bohr one time. I got to hear all those guys talk at seminars. And so I was very privileged in that respect, that I got to know everything. For example, they knew eventually that Germany, our program was started because Einstein knew that the Germans had discovered fission in uranium, and he knew that eventually an atomic bomb was possible. And he went to Roosevelt and told him about this and said, I think we should do something about it so that they don't get that bomb first, or we might be in real trouble. So that's why Roosevelt formed the Manhattan Project, of which Los Alamos was called Project Y, Oak Ridge was Project X, I think, and Hanford was Project Z. And because they wanted to cover both options, both to see if plutonium would work as a bomb, and if they could get enriched uranium to work as a bomb. You know, they had done this work at the University of Chicago with the pile there, and knew that they could achieve criticality, but it was so crude they didn't know if they could make a bomb out of it. So that's why these laboratories were formed. And I happened to be very lucky in that one of the co-discoverers of plutonium was Dr. Kennedy from the University of California at Berkeley, where they discovered plutonium. He was one of the persons doing the research that helped discover it. And he was our top boss in the chemistry division at the time. So my boss reported to Kennedy, and I got up to Kennedy's office occasionally to talk to him about my work too. So I met some very high people there at the time. And another man that I met and became friends with later on was the man in charge of metallurgy, who was out of the University of Chicago, and he became a friend of mine in later years too. So Einstein was the nucleus of the start of the program. Einstein was the one that got the programs to Roosevelt's attention and got it started.
Did you ever see Einstein?
Pardon?
Did you ever see Einstein?
No. He never came out to Los Alamos. No. In fact, he was not part of the project at all. He didn't want to be part of it.
Two questions. Who was the guy, the physicist, that couldn't talk to Roosevelt but got motivated Einstein? Who was that scientist?
You know, I don't know.
He was the one that really had the information and had the concern, but he knew Einstein had to end with Roosevelt.
Yeah. He was one of the guys from the University of Chicago, I'm sure, but I don't know who. I don't really remember who it was.
And the other question was the ultra-pure magnesium oxide task to learn how to purify or was it used in some way?
Yes, it was used in the spectrographic analysis of all the materials. These materials, the plutonium, they couldn't purify that because of various radioactive reactions going on. But the uranium they could. And the mass spectrograph had to be used. There were other scientists that did pure other chemicals that were used in the business too. So mine was just one of them.
So was X or Z the plutonium and uranium plants? Did they each have a focus?
Yes, yes.
Which was which?
Well, you mean by what? By building or what?
No, was Hanford plutonium?
Oh, Hanford was plutonium. Oak Ridge was uranium.
Okay.
And Oak Ridge was had two ways in which they could enrich the plutonium. See, natural uranium only has 0.7% of uranium-235. The rest is inert stuff. And we have, by the way, we have uranium in our area here all over the soil. You can go around with a counter anywhere in this eastern part of Colorado and get a few counts. And in fact, we had a big mine, the Schwarzwälder mine up here in the mountains, that produced a lot of uranium that was used after the war was over. But what was I going to say? So they had to enrich it up. You have to go as far as 5% enrichment, from 0.7 to 5%, to make pellets that will produce electricity. But you have to go way, way up to get pure enough uranium for a uranium bomb. And that's what Iran can do, because they have all these centrifuges. It used to be a very difficult process at Oak Ridge. They had this one building that was a half-mile long, where they went through special filters that would enrich it a little bit at each step, and step until they got it up into the high 90s or the low 90s to a weapons grade uranium.
That was the diffusion process, right?
Yeah.
Did you or the other people have any like badges or anything that watched for the amount of radioactivity?
Oh, absolutely. We had badges of all kinds to see that. And after the war was over, I did some special research on what was called the water boiler uranium. During the war, they were looking at various ways to make a bomb, and they knew that they could sustain a reaction with in a container of water that would contain 1,180 grams of enriched uranium became critical, and they could keep this level so that it produced power, a very low level power, because it was a very small reactor, probably no bigger than it would fit in a box like this. But that became so hot that when the war was over and they had shut that down, they let it decay for I think a year or a year and a half, but they still had this enriched uranium in, which was very expensive. At that time, the only way you could tell how much enriched uranium and plutonium were worth were the cost of the project divided, by the number of grams made. So they spent, and this is back during World War II. They spent over $2 billion on Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. That would be a lot of money today. Oh boy. Well, anyway, so with the number of grams of stuff we had, they valued plutonium at about $90,000 a gram at that time, and my enriched uranium at about $50,000 a gram. So this water boiler with over a kilogram in there was worth a lot of money, and so I did this special pure purification to get that away from the fission products. And the main product left at that time were neutrons. And I received a dose of neutrons over what they knew would be healthful at the time, and I got some cancer from it. But I was compensated for that. I still get some skin cancers from it. I got 2 right now that the doctor took off yesterday.
Did they check you daily?
Pardon?
Did they check you daily?
Oh, yes. Every time we left the laboratory, they took nose swabs to see if you were breathed any alpha particles, and they would check your badges if you were working with radiation that was not particulate. Oh yeah, they checked all the time. And then they had a special program to see if you had any uranium in your system. You would pee in a bucket, and after you had enough, they would boil that down to see how much uranium was in there. And that was kind of a special program too. At first we did it on the plant site, and then in later years when the war was almost over, we got sent down to Albuquerque to spend a weekend there and give the samples there, because they thought we might be getting contamination in it up at the lab. So we did it there, and that was a kind of a nice weekend for us to go down there and get some good food there, you know, and just pee in the bucket until we came home.
Anything else?
Have you been watching the series Manhattan that's been on TV?
I've seen it, yes.
Is that quite accurate?
It's fairly accurate, yes. Yes. Well, some of it isn't, but
Well, they have to.
yeah, because it was Hollywoodized, but some of it is.
Okay, I've got a couple things just to add to Burt's commentary on the SED program. I think I mentioned it in the handout. There were roughly about 3,000 Army personnel that were in the SED program, and one thing that is important to note was that they were all enlisted personnel. Okay, and that's significant because of those enlisted personnel. It was interesting, as Burt mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that they were all degreed chemists, metallurgists, all the engineer types. However, in addition to that, because of the various expertise that the Army needed, not just for the research portion of the Manhattan Project, a lot of these people also were then moved to Tinian Island as well. So not only for the research leading up to the creation of the bomb, but then at Tinian Island, at North Field, at Tinian Island, loading the bombs, maintaining the equipment and all that for loading and maintaining the B-29s. They were actually SED personnel and then other personnel that were assigned to the 509th Composite Group that was actually headed by Colonel Tibbets at the time. They all came from Wendover, Utah, and then all flew to Tinian Island at the time. So there was this whole coordinated effort by the Army and the Army Air Corps to make all this happen. So it was a composite of all of those people that made that happen. And then the other thing I wanted to mention on a personal level, when I got together with Burt initially back some months ago when we were all doing the research for his talk, I had the privilege of meeting Burt's wife, Ann, and the two of them have been married for 70 years. So
71 now.
Well, 71. I just wanted you to know that. So Ann's at home this morning, but I just wanted to make that comment. And then finally, I want to present to Burt our Museum Challenge coin for his presentation this morning. And thank you very much, Burt. Appreciate it very
thank
much.
you very much.
So thank you, and thank you all for coming. Appreciate it, and thanks for being here.